Our theme, as you perhaps are aware, is our Get Us Out campaign that was launched this month. We have many new tools to support this campaign out at the literature table. There's 2 new books out there. The Global Gun Grab, the United Nations Campaign to Disarm Americans, the United Nations Exposed by William Jasper. Both of these books, both the authors of both these books are here tonight. I'll be happy to sign those books and autograph them for you. We also have one other item I'd like to mention. The United Nations special issue of the magazine. This has been a blockbuster so far. It just came out a couple weeks ago. We've already sold 20,000 of these, and they're moving fast. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker. William Norman Grigg joined the staff of the John Birch Society in 1993 and presently serves as senior editor of the New American magazine. Born in Burley, Idaho, and educated at Ricks College, Utah State University, and the National Journalism Center in Washington, D.C., Mr. Grigg currently resides in Appleton, Wisconsin, with his wife Corinne and sons William, Isaiah, and Jefferson. He is the author of 3 books: The Gospel of Revolt, Feminism versus the Family; Freedom on the Altar, the UN's Crusade Against God and Family; and his newest book, just days old, Global Gun Grab, the UN's Campaign to Disarm Americans. Mr. Grigg also wrote and co-produced the video documentaries Tragedy by Design and Justice for All, The International Criminal Court, Rise of the Robber State, and Civilian Disarmament, Prelude to Tyranny. As a correspondent for the New American, Mr. Grigg has covered 9 United Nations conferences and summits, including the recent Small Arms Conference at UN headquarters. Representing the John Birch Society Speakers Bureau, Mr. Grigg has been featured on several nationwide speaking tours and has appeared on C-SPAN. He has also appeared on nationally syndicated radio programs, including Point of View with Marla Maddox, The Ken Hamlin Show, and The Michael Medved Show. Please join me in welcoming Mr. William Norman Grigg.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I have found that by virtue of my complexion, I blend in at certain UN functions, and I like to take advantage of the prejudices of the people who pride themselves on their tolerance. I found that it's not to my advantage, however, as an airline passenger in our current environment. The noblest acts of heroism are those performed without any expectation of mortal recognition. Countless acts of selfless courage were made visible against the backdrop of the horrible events that took place on Black Tuesday. On that terrible morning, the worst that our nation has ever known, literally thousands of average Americans confronted circumstances in which they had to make an instinctive choice for heroism. Among those who answered the terrible summons to sacrifice were Jeremy Glick, Todd Beamer, Thomas Burnett, and others aboard United Flight 93. While we know that these men, each of whom was a young father with young children to raise, decided to stage a counterattack against the terrorists who had seized their plane, their specific acts of heroism are known only to themselves and to God, in whose glorious company they no doubt presently reside. A little appreciated dimension to the saga of United Flight 93 is this. It illustrates how our nation's defense ultimately depends upon the citizenry, not upon our government. Because of existing practices and regulations, the heroes of Flight 93 were armed only with their courage, character, and determination. The terrorists, by way of contrast, were armed with edged weapons, the element of surprise, and a depraved indifference for human life. Most importantly, they displayed the lethal serenity that typifies criminals who know that their victims had been disarmed. Commentator Mark Stein puts these horrendous events in the proper context. Quote, "The airline cabin is the most advanced model of the modern social democratic state, the rarefied version of trends that, on the ground, progress more slowly. There is no smoking. There is 100% gun control. You are obliged by law to do everything the cabin crew tell you to do. The justification for all of this is a familiar one, that in return for surrendering individual liberties, we'll all be collectively better off. That was the deal. Do as you're told, and the FAA will look after you." On Black Tuesday morning, the feds failed spectacularly to honor their end of the bargain, as I'm sure the terrorists knew they would, close quote. After all, Stein Riley notes, the average coach class cabin is the nearest the Western world gets to the condition of those terrorists' home states. These despicable animals in human form knew that they could rely upon the FAA to provide them with a pool of disarmed hostages and flight crews who had been trained to comply with the terrorists' demands. Now, it was the decision of a handful of American patriots to disregard the federal government's hijacking procedures that saved our nation's capital city. The Pennsylvania site where the passengers of Flight 93 departed for eternity, like that state's Civil War battlefield, is ground that is hallowed by the blood of Americans who gave the last full measure of devotion on behalf of freedom. And from their sacrifice, we must take renewed devotion to protect our freedoms from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And the most important right we must defend is the one that protects all our other rights, that of bearing arms. Another much neglected lesson of Flight 93 is the fatal futility of the current educational trend called zero tolerance, a campaign to infect young Americans with an aversive reaction to weapons. Since the Columbine Massacre of 1999, school systems across the country have begun a comprehensive crackdown on any speech or behavior that can be construed as a threat. Scholar John R. Lott, formerly of Yale University Law School, describes, quote, "the brave new world of zero-tolerance schooling as a peculiar realm where young minds are molded to abhor aggression. Schools are banning dodgeball and tag because the games encourage violent behavior. Some schools are removing any references to the military from their libraries. Elementary schools in Texas and Louisiana have suspended students for pointing pencils and saying pow and drawing pictures of soldiers. A fifth grader in St. Petersburg, Florida, was arrested for drawing pictures of weapons. Terrorist threat charges were filed against two 8-year-olds in Irvington, New Jersey for playing cops and robbers with a paper gun. In another incident, a fifth grader was arrested on terrorist charges in Tampa, Florida, after he was caught drawing pictures of weapons. Following the arrest of the fifth grader in Tampa, a school district spokesman explained, quote, "That's the normal procedure in a situation like this." Now contemplate this for a second. In 2001 America, the normal procedure for dealing with a young boy who displays a healthy interest in firearms is to treat him as a potential terrorist, slap the cuffs on his wrists, humiliate him in front of his friends, and teach him that the state has no tolerance for those who think incorrect thoughts. Now, Jeremy Glick, Todd Beamer, Thomas Burnett, and the other heroes of Flight 93 were not products of the zero-tolerance system. They knew the uses of righteous violence in defending freedom. Will the same be true 20 or 30 years from now of those who are presently enrolled in government schools? How do we explain the effort to indoctrinate American children into an anti-gun worldview? The explanation points to another neglected principle. In matters of disarmament, all roads lead to the United Nations. The effort to create a culture of zero tolerance for civilian weapons ownership is part of a process I call psychological disarmament, which has been a priority for the United Nations since before there was a permanent UN organization. Let us consider the UN propaganda documentary entitled Armed to the Teeth, The Worldwide Plague of Small Arms. One segment of that video depicts a group of American school children who have been through a process of psychological disarmament, and they are shown at a school assembly reciting a pledge never to touch a weapon. These American children, who are tragically typical of the inmates of our government school system, are asked, "How are we to prevent wars and other kinds of violence?" "Stop selling guns," one boy replies. "Only policemen should have guns." A young girl added, "I would just stop making guns all of a sudden and then just have the government prohibit guns from everybody." When I first saw this scene from the UN video, the following quote came unbidden to my mind. Quote, "When an opponent declares, 'I will not come over to your side,' I calmly say, 'Your child belongs to us already. What are you? You will pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in this new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community.'" Close quote. Thus spoke Adolf Hitler as he presided over the psychological disarmament and reconstruction of Germany's youth. Hitler, it should be noted, was one of history's most successful advocates of civilian disarmament. Quote, "The most foolish mistake we could possibly make would be to allow the subject races to possess arms," commented Hitler on one occasion. "History shows that all conquerors who have allowed their subject races to carry arms have prepared their downfall by so doing." Close quote. Hitler's National Socialist regime, which was faithfully patterned upon the model of communist Russia, was blessed with what the so-called Million Mom March, Sarah Brady, and other advocates of civilian disarmament would call common-sense gun laws, Possession of firearms was limited to the military and the police and a few select civilians whose political reliability was beyond question: government officials, party members, perhaps the occasional celebrity. Even as late as 1939, after the Anschluss and the bloodless appeasement-aided conquest of Czechoslovakia made Hitler seem all but invincible, there was still a visible anti-Nazi opposition movement in Germany. But as the London Times lamented, in Germany, quote, "Civilians are disarmed and so powerless," close quote. And once the Nazis conquered France, they exported their enlightened gun laws to that country as well. One prominent news organization bewailed the fact that, quote, "The Nazi decrees reduced the French people to as low a condition as that occupied by the German people. Military orders now forbid the French to do things which the German people have not been allowed to do since Hitler came to power: to own radios, to organize public meetings, to retain possession of firearms. All these things are prohibited for the subjugated people of France," close quote. This sorrowful description of a disarmed and therefore subject population was published by the New York Times, which has since distinguished itself for its tireless promotion of Nazi-style gun control policies. Soviet dictator Vladimir Lenin pioneered the methods of modern totalitarianism, and his regime, which would go on to slaughter tens of millions of people, was the model for every totalitarian state, including Nazi Germany. One of the Soviet state's first priorities was to disarm its political opposition. A 1918 order issued by Lenin himself instructed Communist Party officials, quote, "Your first response to opposition must be to establish a dictatorial troika and to introduce mass terror. There is not a moment to lose. You must act resolutely. Immediate execution for anyone caught with a firearm," close quote. The Soviet communist regime's treatment of the Cossack population illustrates how disarmament prefigures mass murder. A January 1919 secret Communist Party directive designated as, quote, "the only politically correct measure, massive terror and a merciless fight against the rich Cossacks, who must be exterminated and physically disposed of down to the last man," close quote. A few weeks later, the Cossacks were informed that they would have to surrender their sidearms, both guns and swords. Within 2 years, Cossacks were being liquidated in death camps, some of which featured an assembly line-style killing system involving the use of poison gas. In Soviet Russia, as in Nazi Germany, civilian disarmament, what less honest people call gun control, was the necessary precursor for mass murder. Many of those imprisoned in the Gulag prison camp system understood this principle. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the most famous former inmate of the Gulag, wrote, quote, "How we burned in the prison camps thinking, what would things have been like if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive and had to say goodbye to his family." If the Russian people had the means and the will to mount an armed resistance, Solzhenitsyn concluded, the secret police organs would very quickly have suffered a shortage of officers, and the cursed machine would have ground to a halt. Now, the machine, referred to by Solzhenitsyn, is the apparatus of police-state oppression, a system in which the central government has a monopoly on the use of force, which is deployed through a centralized, militarized police force. This is precisely the formula for world peace prescribed by the United Nations. The UN propaganda film Armed to the Teeth describes legal weapons as those used by armies and police forces to protect us. Civilian-owned weapons, by way of contrast, are denounced by the UN as illegitimate and condemned for bringing insecurity, pain, suffering, and devastation. In his 2000 official report entitled We the Peoples, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan expanded upon this notion by saying the following, quote, "Controlling the proliferation of illicit, that is, civilian-owned firearms, is a necessary first step. These weapons must be brought under the control of states, and states must be held responsible for their transfer." In other words, in order to protect human beings from the scourge of war and the horrors of genocide, firearms must be the exclusive possession of governments, the very entities that, when corrupted, are responsible for the horrors of genocide. The UN's prime directive is to get weapons out of the hands of civilians by any means necessary: enticement, bribery, threats, and eventually by lethal force. Sami Faltis of the UN-connected Bonn International Center for Conversion puts it this way, quote, "A subtle mix of rewards and penalties is needed for a weapons collection program to succeed. Ultimately, the ownership of arms should not be left to the personal choice of individuals. The state needs to preserve its monopoly of the legitimate use of force." Close quote. Now, UN-approved weapons collection programs include so-called gun buybacks and turn-ins, such as those that are carried on in many cities in the United States. Dr. Edward J. Lawrence, who is a consultant to the UN's Register of Conventional Arms, has helped to organize various gun buybacks in American cities as a way of carrying out what the UN calls micro-disarmament, that is, the disarmament of civilians. But there is an even grander design in which the UN itself would have an arms monopoly, with each formally independent national government exercising a limited franchise within that monopoly. That plan is outlined in this notorious document, State Department Document 7277, Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World, which was unveiled by President John F. Kennedy in 1961. Freedom from War outlined a three-stage program for creating an all-powerful UN global peace force. In Stage 3 of that design, quote, "States would retain only those forces, non-nuclear armaments, and establishments required for the purpose of maintaining internal order. They would also support and provide agreed manpower for a UN peace force." Close quote. Now, just as ominously, the document continues. The manufacture of armaments would be prohibited except for those of agreed types and quantities to be used by the UN peace force and those required to maintain internal order. All other armaments would be destroyed or converted to peaceful purposes. All other armaments would obviously include all civilian-owned firearms. Let us consider again our circumstances in the aftermath of Black Tuesday. Our badly depleted military now sustains UN-mandated peacekeeping missions in Bosnia, Kosovo, Korea, and elsewhere, even as we are engaged in a UN-supervised war on terrorism in Asia. Our skies are patrolled by AWACS radar planes manned by foreign servicemen under the command of NATO, a UN subsidiary, and NATO naval vessels patrol our eastern seacoast. In the meantime, the Bush administration has created an Office of Homeland Security, which would make a very good vehicle to serve as a centralized, militarized internal security agency of the sort envisioned in the Freedom from War program. These policies are drawn directly from the existing blueprints for a UN-controlled world. And we can expect that the same power elite that has imposed these measures to follow that blueprint faithfully, and civilian disarmament is the most crucial element of that plan. The Second Amendment, as important as it is not the most important protection of our God-given right to armed self-defense. The most important protection resides in the fact that the Constitution does not give the central government the power to disarm the law-abiding citizenry. But the Second Amendment certifies that our founders understood this critical fact. In our system, the government does not have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Any government that claims such a monopoly is, in principle, totalitarian, and the UN is seeking to create nothing less than a world government based upon that totalitarian principle. As the proud towers of the World Trade Center imploded, Americans witnessed the death of more than 5,000 of their countrymen. But it would take more than 34,000 World Trade Center bombings to equal the body count compiled by totalitarian governments during the 20th century. In his study, Death by Government, political scientist R.J. Rummel documented that between 170 and 360 million people were killed in that period by their own governments, and civilian disarmament was a prelude to every single episode of genocide and political mass murder. Now, think now of the diseased ambition represented by the UN's announced intention to disarm the world's inhabitants in the name of peace, and imagine how that ambition will be translated into bloodshed if we allow it to be consummated. Any worthwhile war on terrorists will require that we liberate our nation from the United Nations and evict that squalid, pestiferous organization from our shores. An America that is independent of the UN, avoids foreign entanglements, and teams with armed Americans ready and willing to defend their rights would have relatively little to fear from terrorism. Building a nation worthy of the heroes of Flight 93 is nothing less than a moral duty. In the words of Todd Beamer, one of those heroes, let's roll. Thank you very much.